Well, good morning.
Good morning.
What is that stuff on the floor? Uh, Good to see you all today. Lois already commented, I have a stack of books with me. This is mostly show and tell. I'm not really getting into all of them. But we'll do that. Welcome back. We've got this week and next week to wrap up our series on vocation. And hopefully, I've enjoyed the little tour we've taken so far. Hopefully you have too. Last week, we covered a few things. We got through just some more highlights from the book called Listen, God is Calling, all about vocation. And it talks a lot about the gap between Sunday and Monday. You know, the language, the practices, the priorities we have on a Sunday morning. What do people hear? Is it all about church, church, church? Or do we ever really do we ever talk about much of your own life in the week, specifically more than just broad strokes? So how can we honor the vocations that everybody has the rest of the week in worship, so church experience doesn't feel like it's completely isolated and divorced from the rest of your life? So that was one thing we talked about. Any reflections on that as you've gone through the week from and I did notice who was on the prayers last week? Was that you? And you worked in the bit on
Ukraine and
Yep.
Israel and you, someone in your heart.
Yeah. Yeah, so like instant feedback there in service. Thank you for doing that.
But Matt, if I could comment on that.
Yeah.
Interesting that I was the one who pushed for that in the beginning, and you made a comment that, well, is it gonna be a problem? Can you pray for one group of people and forget another group of people?
Yeah.
So when you mentioned in your prayers the Israelis, you didn't say anything about the
I
Palestinians.
didn't know.
That was me.
You noted
That
that?
was me.
Oh, that was you.
If you're talking about last week.
Yeah.
So then,
That's
immediately
okay.
got my back up, and thought that's just what you were talking about, but isn't that what the church is supposed to
I
do?
mean, I'm really glad for the passage in, is it Romans 8, I think. There's a really famous part of Romans 8, or at least I know it well because of funerals. There's nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, neither height nor depth, that whole bit. Before that, there's a line that says, you know, that the Holy Spirit intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. So if we leave anything out, or if we,
I thought of that in the prayers. And it was
because we'll never get it all.
Right.
Yeah, so I thank you for doing that, Lois.
Teacher said.
Well, in that respect, Judy was the teacher, so thank you. But I mean, you're never gonna get it all. Martin Luther drove his confessors insane, because he kept thinking that he was leaving something out. Oh no, I'll be damned if I don't confess every single sin. Well, what if I did something and I didn't realize I did it? Will I be in trouble? And that was part of his journey to saying, oh gosh, it's gotta be grace. Right, so the Holy Spirit covers anything we forget or omit.
He kind of beat himself up.
Yeah, I sincerely believe that's one of the reasons that he was encouraged to go into teaching and not stay in the monastery. It's because they were like, no, I gotta get out of here.
Move on.
I used to think like he'd go sins confessed, and then he would have the pride of having his sins confessed, so then he had to sin of pride.
Yeah, he took it very seriously. Yeah. So, okay, any other thoughts on what we can do on our Sundays in our church world to help bridge the gap between here and your other vocations? Remember, we had the visual map of the three realms, right? There was home and work, church, and then kind of like the citizen, right? Most of what you do during the week was in the first column. So how does what we do in the church world bridge the gap to the rest of your life? All your vocations. Any other thoughts on it?
I, several times when I've had parents in my office that I was expelling or suspending their students for a long period of time, and their parents are losing it and crying and you know, against all rules, I prayed with them. And it seemed to help.
You didn't get in trouble for that?
Oh, if somebody knew about it, I would have been fired.
That's it.
Did you ask them first?
No, sometimes I felt
Yeah.
And this is gonna sound horrible. It was almost always the black parents that receptive prayer more than the white parents.
Sure.
I don't know why, but anyway, multiple times in my career, I just felt that it just felt right.
Sure. And sometimes you go with what the Holy Spirit is, prodding you to do. At the very least, whether or not they share the same faith, you went out of your way, it sounds like, to show some level of compassion. That you recognize this was a hard situation. And at the very least, hopefully, that comes across as that you're not heartless, that you genuinely understand and appreciate your situation. Now, how did that bridge happen? Did you feel as though what was going on Sundays empowered you or equipped you or encouraged you to do that? Okay. So that was the crux of that book, is celebrating this teaching that Luther lifted up of vocations that started as against the Catholic practice of the day of only saying that a certain group was holy, only certain callings were true callings. But taking that away, taking out of that now the reaction, the anti, and claiming it as just something that's central to who we are as Lutheran Christians, to say we live out our faith through all our callings, that the Spirit is working through us through every aspect of our life. How do we emphasize that? That was the gist of that. I think that's going to be something that's going to be an ongoing conversation, and at least for myself. And
I think 20 years ago would have been a lot easier
okay,
than it is today, because society's not receptive to that.
you've done this before, Roger, but you just provided me the perfect segue. Okay, let's talk about society. We'll come back to the other part that I wanted to reflect on. That was, you couldn't just gift wrapped on a platter. Segue right there.
Got it.
Okay, so have you heard the term postmodernism?
Yes.
Okay, so there was the modern age, and now they're saying we're in the postmodern age. Things are more relative now. Okay, there's a whole classes are taught on this, just postmodern. Another aspect of postmodernism is called post-Christendom. Have you heard that one? So Christendom is the idea that Christianity, you could put a dom on the end, right? Like a kingdom, that Christianity was just the institution. It was just such a central part of life in the northern, basically the West, right? Northern Europe and North America, other parts of the world too, but just Christianity was just central.
The kingdom.
And that is not the case. And we can bemoan that and lament it, but it is what it is. It's not a recent thing. It's the shift started happening at least 50 years ago. And as more people look at this and study this and look at demographics and trends and that, this has been a long time and worse. So what I have in show and tell for you today is just a lot of my books on my shelf. I went to seminary. I started in 2003, so a lot of my stuff's 20 years old. I've been going back to some of it lately, and it's been interesting on the one hand to just actually absorb it more now that I have some more experience under my belt and I'm not in the middle of a really intense academic program. But also it's interesting because 20 years ago, people were really just starting to talk about and write about the shift that was happening with technology. We were talking about that before the recording started, right? How the new technological stuff has changed the world so much. Well, 2003, smartphones weren't even out yet. And so it's interesting to see the good kind of seed at the core of what they were writing, but also how much they're off because they had no idea what was coming and how much it would change even more. So that's what I want to lift up today. So first of all, the one I am going to read from a little bit is, there was a 4-book set. This one's called Church in the Inventive Age. This one came out after I was out of seminary. This was 2010, so slightly more recent. Smartphones had come out by this point. But what I want to, there was church in the inventive age, preaching in the inventive age, there was community in the inventive age. So he's got this whole series. His name is Doug Paget. He's the founder of a congregation in Minneapolis called Solomon's Porch. This was part of a movement called the Emerging Church Movement or the Emergent Church Movement. And that was mostly mainline denominations like the ELCA, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians. They had this thing where they would start these congregations here and there that were not normal format, right? They were non-traditional. They met in a garage. They met like this place we went and worshiped at once. You sat on couches in a big open room. Communion was like, okay, there's a table over there with wine and bread, go serve yourself. It was like, it was intentionally supposed to break all the norms down, preaching in the round, things like that. Some of them had like a dinner church, some of them met in a garage and you fixed cars for the people in the community who needed help while in them worship. Like each one kind of had its own blueprint and model. And so it was a big deal at the time to go visit those. What can we learn from them? Right? But it worked, each one was very context specific, right? So he was one of the guys who had a church like this. And so he wrote a bunch of books. The part of this I want to share was page 11. He lays out 4 ages, okay? And I just want to describe to you the 4 ages, because I think whatever else they might have missed in the last 14, 13 years, I think this part is accurate. He says, I once was in a small group meeting with famed organizational expert Peter Drucker. Out of everything he said, one thought has stuck with me more than the others. He said, the world my parents were born into was essentially the same as the world of Abraham and Sarah from the Bible. Drucker was born in Vienna in 1909, was pointing out that the world into which his parents were born, specifically Austria in the 19th century, operated under a social structure that had been in place in rural areas for a millennium. He contrasted that with the world into which he was born, Austria at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Just one generation earlier, the majority of human beings lived like their parents and great-grandparents had. They worked the land, rarely lived more than 100 miles from where they were born, and knew they'd be lucky to see their 50th birthdays. Mid-19th century culture was, as Drucker said, nearly identical to the culture of the ancient Israelites. Both were part of the agrarian age. The Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s brought about dramatic cultural upheaval in Europe and the US. Certainly, earlier inventions like the printing press had a broad impact on society, but the printing press didn't directly change the way people fed themselves or moved from place to place or earned a living. The Industrial Revolution did. People moved from farms to cities. Men and women who had once worked alongside each other in the fields left their families at home to work in factories. Manufactured goods became the currency of the culture. The next cultural shift began when the industrial age was still booming. During the 1920s and 30s, the information age began to take hold, thanks in no small part to the growth of the manufacturing and shipping industries that had taken place during the industrial age. As people had access to books, newspapers, radios, and eventually televisions, knowledge and information became the most valuable assets of the culture. In the same way, the inventive age is being born out of the information age. Knowledge is no longer the goal, but the means by which we accomplish new, even unimagined goals. So it goes agrarian, so farming, rural, to industrial, to, and if you think of that, even just right there, if the agrarian age is pretty much what they had in Bible times, all of human history up until the mid to late 1800s, then the industrial age, and then maybe 50 years later, the information age, and now here we are 100 years later in the middle of this inventive age. So how much has changed in just the last 150 years compared to the millennia preceding?
My father the other day, how much he changed, he's 84, and how much he can remember
Yeah,
to where my kids see now as like beyond just even this. I mean, just having a phone in your house was not a norm when he was a kid. It was,
It was always in a place of comments too, like it's in the hallway, sitting on its own desk.
Yeah.
Conversation.
Yeah.
And you go on a party line, so everybody can hear what you're talking about.
Or he remembers the first television in
Mhm.
his county.
Mhm.
My grandfather and my father's uncle owned the first TV sales shop. And had to run antennas up had the first cable because they ran antennas to the top of the mountain, so they would run the cable around the town so people could get service and sell that cables, that's how cables started. I mean, this is just that little bit, like, there was a little, in one lifetime,
So
it's
I,
huge.
You're making your father sound like an antique, and I can remember when all those things started too.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess with one lifetime, it's like that, right?
and when I was a kid, we had a potbelly stove in our kitchen,
Mhm.
cause it was an old 100-year-old farmhouse that my
Yeah.
parents bought.
Use corn cobs.
We had a rotary
We didn't
phone.
have a burn corner.
We had, they still didn't put we still don't have air conditioning in that house.
Because those houses were, I grew up in a 100-year-old house.
Yeah.
It was the first house on, and then the Midwest, houses were not that important. It was the farmland,
I'm sure.
and the house came last.
As a kid,
Yeah, it
the
could
farmhouse I grew up in had the 4 panes,
Mhm.
and it was just one single sheet of glass, no storm windows.
Yeah.
And
It got cold.
no, it had one central heating system, and that was in the kitchen, which was a cast iron stove.
Yeah.
We put corn cobs in because there wasn't any wood around.
Yeah.
So in the Midwest, it's not any much wood, so it's corn cobs.
In Iowa, it's,
Yeah, and he had a register in the center of the
yep,
kitchen,
Mhm.
and that went directly up to the parent room.
we had 3 of those in our house.
Yeah.
That was the only heat we had
We had one,
upstairs.
and it went to the parents' room.
Yeah.
And
Oh, no, we had one of
then
them
you
in
had to leave, you
every
had to leave the door open
Yeah,
to the stairwell
Right.
as your,
At night, yeah.
as your draft. And
yeah.
I can remember many times waking up in the morning in the middle of the winter, because they were much colder then than they are now. And have ice that thick on the inside of
West,
it.
oh, I remember.
I wouldn't go
Right,
back.
her name was Frost.
So the generational categories, right? There's Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, all that, right? So I'm considered to be born in this little micro generation, right on the in between
Maybe
Gen X and millennials.
No,
And that the reason there's this little 5 to 7 year pocket is because we were riding the crest of all the technological waves. Like, so I grew up, I know exactly everything y'all are talking
Yeah.
about.
That's it.
And, but I used MS-DOS in kindergarten.
Yeah.
We had internet in the library in 6th grade with the all the noises.
modem.
When I got to college, they had
$300.
they had a computer lab, but we still had discs.
Yep.
And then, and
Yeah.
and the fraternity I was in a dorm, and that dorm, only a few years before I got there, did each dorm room individually get its own phone lines and cable lines.
Mhm.
Before that, there was one phone in the hallway,
Mhm.
and one phone and one cable line down in the lounge. As I was there, like in the middle of my time there, they were installing Ethernet outlets in each room so you could get the internet in each room. In the course of my time there, and a little bit before I got there, and maybe 2 years after I left, the fraternity folded. It was a local, it didn't have the national support, but one of the big reasons for that was everybody started doing their own thing. Right, each person, we did a video, like a promotional video for the fraternity, like, here's a tour of the house on a camcorder with the VHS tape, going through recording, and it was funny and it was embarrassing. Each person in the house was watching the same episode of The Simpsons individually in their own room. So the shifts, like, we're living through these, and so the amount of change in the last 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years is astronomical compared to everything.
Right.
Yeah, I was.
No wonder people are stressed out.
I was really deep into that at that point, because by that time I was an adult and working,
Mhm.
and as working in the industrial, so I started off with basic language and then started doing the hardware. And at that time, hardware was a big thing, software was just something new,
Mhm.
everything was hardwired. And I remember the company wanted me to learn, because we were making our own proprietary computers for the things we were making, and they got to be expensive. So they were converting over to buying off the shelf computers to run this equipment, just making the software change. And they made me, the company wanted everybody in the business to be very PC fluent.
Mhm.
So they made us all buy them, but they gave us the money interest free, and they would just take it out of your paycheck every so often. But I remember the first computer I bought was an Apple IIe with 2 floppy disks, and it cost me $2,300.
Yeah.
It was not cheap.
Surprisingly, their price for a computer hasn't dropped. It's still about 2,300
Right, for a bag, a lot more computer.
for an Apple, yeah.
Like, I'm.
Which still seems expensive.
Paying $386 from
Yeah.
Radio Shack, and I thought they like $1,600 for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, astronomical. Now you go down there and get one that's like 10,000 times the
This
processing.
has more processing power than.
Yeah.
Well, even like when we went to the moon, they only had 16K of memory. And it was, and it wasn't solid state memory. I remember working, God, you really made me feel old. I remember working with, donut memory, magnetic memory, and little donuts were wrapped, they looked like coils.
Yeah.
And a 6 meg RAM board was about this big and about that tall. And it had big donuts all over it.
Diana Asher talked about when she worked at the FBI, it's because she had a little bit of experience with computers. And, you know, so she was there where the computers were the size of a room.
Yep, I worked on it.
So we went from, oh, sorry.
Did you?
So they got a fun little, you know, illustration here,
Yeah.
for the folks at home. You go from the agrarian age to the industrial to the information, and it says, but a new age is dawning. And this is his symbol, that publisher symbol for the inventive. So let me tell you a little bit about the inventive age, and then I'll finish with show and tell here. An unknown person said, change is the essence of life. Be willing to surrender what you are for what you could become. Well, that almost sounds like a Christian teaching right there, right? Surrender yourself, let Jesus take the wheel, all of that. But, you know, Facebook intentionally would just, they still do this, just change how they do things, change the layout, change the format every couple of years, if that, on purpose, because they wanted you to keep adapting and adjusting, and you know, that's all that's intentional to keep you engaging with their product. He said, it's clear that something is shifting. Remember, this is 14 years ago. The first time I used the internet, I imagine my reaction was a bit like that of the early pioneers seeing a train traverse the prairie for the first time. Something I never even knew I wanted, that suddenly became indispensable. It was a moment when I was reminded that the future is all about possibility. This is the inventive age. It's an age when we have no idea what's coming next or where it will come from. It's thrilling, he says. Not everybody feels that way. Much of what we knew for certain 15, even 10 years ago, that you needed a cable coming into your house to make phone calls, that a car could only run on gas, that once you started wearing glasses, you had to wear them for life, has been turned upside down. Right now, we live in a world filled with ideas and tools and discoveries we couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. There is bioengineered corn growing in the African desert. You can carry a library's worth of books in your hand and your entire CD collection in your pocket. Scientists can create entirely new materials at the subatomic level. You can get a college degree from your living room. There are people living in a space station. What's more, I can talk to them through my Twitter account. In 1963, the US Patent and Trademark Office processed 90,982 applications. In 2008, it processed 485,312. While the US population doubled in that time, patent applications have increased more than 5 times. But the inventive age isn't solely about inventions any more than the agrarian age was solely about farming. As in the previous ages, the inventive age is marked by changes in the way we think, what we value, what we do, and how we do it. And so the rest of the chapter gets into those things. What do we value? How do we think? Why, you know, how do we do things? Okay.
Probably finding too that a group of people can change what we think just by, I mean, I can't do it, of course, but they can do it just by their equipment, you know, they can change a word or two or change an attitude.
Yeah. And this is before AI got big. This was before things like deep
We
fakes
haven't
and
started to see that yet.
all that. So then let me just do a little show and tell. My senior year of seminary, we got a new preaching professor, and he was trying, no offense, Sam, he was trying to talk a little bit. He's the one playing the bagpipes, one of the guys playing the bagpipes in that video you showed me.
Yeah.
Great guy. I've had summer Greek with him, so I learned all that with him. But his first year, and he's not even teaching preaching anymore. He moved back into the languages, which is where his specialty was. But he had us read this book by Richard Lisher called The End of Words, The Language of Reconciliation and the Culture of Violence. And a lot of this is about, instead of just saying a statement, presenting an idea, it's about metaphors and imagery. Think about memes now. Memes weren't a thing then. But how much of our culture now is based on visual stuff? Or even just slang that's built on some other slang, that, like the end of words, that, how many entries are added to the dictionary now every year? Not because necessarily we all use all those words, but they're out there. And so the dictionary has to say, well, people are using them, we better define them, right? Okay. Christianity After Religion. This is a book by Diana Butler Bass. This one is also a little newer. This one came out in, where's the copyright? 90, no, that's not it. Oops. Losing my mind. Anybody know? This was a pretty big book at the time. 2012, oh my gosh. So this one's a little newer too. But this is getting into the whole, well, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. So
Oh, yeah.
this is, I've talked about this a couple times. The church as institution is no longer, this is post-Christendom, right? So what does that mean? She offers a fresh interpretation of the spiritual but not religious trend and shares a hopeful vision for a renewed faith that stays true to the real message of Jesus. A lot of folks left the church because they were tired of organized religion, right? They're tired of hypocrisy. They're tired of institutions. They're tired of, systems that can't keep up with the times, right? So a lot of people left the church for that. So she sees it as an opportunity. How do we tap into this? If people want to be spiritual, then let's get back to the message and the spirit of Jesus's teaching. Right?
That's basically a cop, because I got caught into that, because I was in the industrials and I would made that same excuse, and I said, well, I'm spiritual, not religious,
Right.
but it's a cop out.
Sure.
It was a total,
It can be.
no, I can guarantee most people that said it, it was a cop out. It was to get you off the back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And some people, yes. So yes, and yes, people will say that just to get people to leave them alone.
Mhm.
And I don't deny that they have some sense of spirituality or connection to what's the AA thing, the higher power, right? Something bigger than yourself. So people will believe in that, but they have a hard time believing in a church, right? A denomination. What does that even mean? This one is called Love Wins. I would love to do a study on this one sometime. Maybe we can do this in the fall. This came out not that well. This one is 2000 and real what? Radical. Oh, radical. Yeah, this is 2011. He was a mega church pastor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I'm sorry.
Rob Bell.
Oh, yes.
And he got disillusioned with a lot of what they were saying and sort of the very institutional corporate model of church. And so he put out a series of videos called Numa. Have you guys watched those? Those are good. This book is called Love Wins, a book about heaven, hell, and the fate of every person who ever lived. And he gets into about how a lot of our common conventional wisdom and teachings about hell really don't really come from the Bible. They come from things like Paradise Lost or Dante's Inferno. And so he gets really edgy by by basically saying, I don't think hell is a thing. Maybe hell is the suffering we have on earth.
That's bad.
If God is truly gracious and merciful, why would anybody be sent to hell? Maybe there's something to the purgatory thing, but maybe it's not like the institute. So he explores all of this. This is a very good conversation.
Other than Revelations, where does it mention fire pits and,
Daniel,
that's right.
the Gospels do. I mean, they will be thrown into the outer darkness or the fire where they'll be keeping his energy.
And what is
Jesus said that.
Yeah.
But he was the way.
But
Some
he-
of that could be explained just because.
Oh, sure.
They wanted you to see how very important it was.
Yeah. Or cultural context of the time. What did the outer
Yeah,
darkness?
so see, that was not a new concept. I mean, the
Right.
Greeks had
Yeah,
Hades,
Yeah.
so that was not a new concept.
The Old Testament talks about Sheol, which is not a place of eternal torment and fire, but you're just shadows, almost more like fields of asphodel in Greek mythology. So, but this is a provocative book. It wrestles with all of those things that we just mentioned. What does this actually mean? But even there, things that were considered bedrock Christian teachings, or even those are being challenged and saying, well, are they really meaning what they think we mean? And so that's kind of the hallmark of the inventive age, is to challenge and test, and things are more fluid. This one was our last history class. It's called The American Religious Experience, a concise history. So I thought, well, let me go to the last chapter and see what it said, because the last chapter was pluralism and periphery. So it's talking about we're living in a society that has a lot more pluralism, many religions or no religion, all living together, side by side. And what does that mean? You know, does the crusade approach of convert or die really work? No. History has kind of shown that it doesn't have a lasting faith implanted in people. But you know, how do we coexist while sharing our faith? Or saying, you know, we do believe this is the way, but not necessarily then assuming that that's, you know, how to communicate with that with others. What's the best way to witness? Periphery. The church is more to the periphery now and the fringe. So okay. However, this was interesting to me to read this, because I got to a point where I'm like, oh gosh, you totally don't know what you're talking about. Because this one was written in 2006, right? What, about a year before smartphones hit, before social media hit, before all the algorithms and the AI and I mean, things were already polarized then, but nothing like it is now.
Polarizing, not polarized.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so she's got this whole thing in here, which I appreciate, about how, you know, and now that the church is embracing these things, we're just gonna move into this age of more harmony, and we're all gonna be able to get along and live together. Kind of, but she bases it on the knowledge she had at the time, like looking at the trends of the church and the direction things were going. She was optimistic. And how much has changed? I'm not as optimistic as she was here. I still trust in God's
I wonder how she.
Holy Spirit. I don't know. But it was, I mean, how much has changed? So this was my show and tell, like, how much has changed even in the last 20 years?
Mhm.
And what is it about the age we're living in? And it's so, here's what I wrote down. I said, we're in the middle of a shift. It's not like any of these ages that Doug Paget described were like a light switch. It was all gradual, you know, we're still in the industrial age, or the part of it, we're still in the information age, we're still into the inventive age, and there's still agrarian stuff happening. But we're still in the middle of a shift. It might take 50 years for things to gel into what people 100 years from now will look back and say, well, now this is the age we're in, right? This is when.
I don't think it's ever gonna gel.
And maybe it won't.
I think we've hit, because it was always change, the wheel of change is always going, but
Yeah.
it's slow. It's picking up momentum.
Yeah,
At some point in time, either it's gonna fall apart or the momentum just has to carry it forward.
yeah, the wheels will fall off.
Mhm.
So,
If you read any of Richard Rohr, he talks about, how you're gonna have the change and the groups of people that are willing to go with the change, you know, you might not like the change and I might not like the change. But if you hang in there with it, eventually we're gonna come out of this rough period and we're gonna have to build a new church.
you have to have
Or
that,
you can leave it.
yeah, you have to have that faith. The church, the Big C church, but I think our denomination, I think we're gonna keep shrinking for a while until we kind of hit a critical mass and then start to bounce back. And that's what this guy is saying, to, you know, actually look at the world around you. That's what I'm trying to get to with vocation as a new vehicle.
I see it, it's like slipping down a hillside, you get so fast, you can't even grab a stone to stop,
Yeah.
so, you know, to stop you from sliding. And
Sure.
so then you gotta hit something very hard in order for it to stop, so.
Or eventually you get to the bottom of the valley and you come back
I
up.
know
the
that's
other side.
possible too.
And this ties back into our last conversation, I think, about Job. Like maybe right now, we're getting slapped in the face with how very little influence and power we actually have
Mhm.
as a church. We were the top dog. We were Job, right? We were helping the little guys. We were doing great things, and oh geez, now wait, what happened?
Mhm.
Church is kind of feeling like we're in the ash heap lately for a lot of folks. And the other part is the part I think that the history book was naive about, not naive, but maybe a little, was that it would just continue to slide into something good. So as a bunch of stuff changed, as pluralism becomes more normalized, as the world shifts and changes at a pace we can't keep up with or grab onto, she thought, I think it's she, and Lynn, I guess, can go either way. Either way, that it would just continue on this positive trajectory. Well, gee, what happened? Boy, a lot of folks really don't like the amount of change that's happening, and they're just saying, oh gosh, no, we're gonna clamp down on all of this change. Because it's the pace of it is threatening and scary and breakneck. And so we're gonna go back to, why do you think a Handmaid's Tale has become so popular again? Because a lot of folks feel like folks are trying to go back to the 1800s.
Amy, I don't think they just kind of stay there.
A little bit, but there's no coincidence that a lot of the stuff is going back to the 1800s or let's be constitutional originalists. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but what time period was that? It's the agrarian age. It's before all the big changes started to kick in. That's not coincidental that folks are trying to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like that little robot in Wall-E. Whoa, whoa, whoa. The guy who saw all the mess and all the tracks, that was his reaction. Oh, this is too much. We gotta clean this up.
And the church will never grow or change if we all develop that attitude, right?
Probably not. And that's why there's a history in the church, even before Luther and the Reformation, of folks like John Hus who tried to reform things. There was the big schism in around the year 1000 between the Eastern and the Western Church. There's a bunch of folks that tried things in the church that got, labeled heretics and kicked out. And some of those groups, there's vestiges of them in Egypt, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in India, Syria, branches that the Orthodox Church trimmed years ago. So, yeah, you're right. There's always change. But boy, the pace feels, like Roger was saying, a lot.
It's picked up, I was moving a lot
Yeah,
faster.
it's moving back.
So, so here's what I wrote. We're in the middle of a shift. And I would rather be like Julie's saying, I would rather be the church that's nimble, that's integrated into this society and trying to roll with it as hard as it may be. Because I think the gospel that we have is so good that people need to hear it still, maybe more than ever. So if we can be flexible and adaptable, which apparently are some of the hallmarks of the age we're in, if we can talk about the unity of the triune God, but the diversity of the triune God, and how we're made in the image of that God, so we can have unity is not the same as uniformity. I've said that before, right? So we can live with pluralism, we can live with diversity, but what's our core? What's our anchor, right? That's the part that might be getting lost in the shuffle. What's the core? What's the anchor? We can adapt, right? Christ walks on the chaotic water in the storm. But, do we have the faith to step out with him onto those waves? That's the tough part. But the other part of it is that we have to have an action reflection thing. Now more than ever, we might try things, but then we have to be able to reflect on it and say, did this work or not? And if not, we'll try something different.
I mean, I think maybe.
Which is also disorienting when for 1,000 years, here's how you do it. Why do we need to change it?
I think it's going a little too fast. I mean, the baby boomer went from 1946 to 1962.
Yeah.
That's a long stretch. I don't understand 62, but anyway, it was that baby boomer went from that period to that period. Now the generations are like every other 6 months.
No.
It's not, I'm being facetious, but
Yeah.
my point is, my point of trying to get across, everything's moving, and I think at a point, we won't be able to adapt to it, it's moving too fast.
Mhm.
Humans won't be able to adapt properly.
All right, you did it again. So now I want to go back to my other thing I wanted to talk about. Last week, it was a little rushed, it was a little forced, but we tried 10 minutes of centering prayer. Where we just sat still with a candle and a phrase and just were quiet. No agenda. And we didn't have much time to process it. So, and we said it's not everybody's cup of tea, but there are practices, spiritual practices that can fit any personality. If we don't listen in the midst of all this noise, then we're not gonna, the book was called Listen, God is Calling. Whatever God is calling us to do or be, we're gonna miss it if we don't somehow give attention to. So I wanna come back to that. We're in the middle of a shift. The world is kind of crazy. It feels like it's off the rails a lot of the time. I think generations younger than us are able to roll with it more, and at the same time, they have the higher anxiety rates of young generation.
That's right.
So that, I don't think that's a coincidence either. Our brains aren't equipped for this speed.
It's like,
So what do you think? What has your listening experience been in the middle of all of this?
Yeah, sure. I went to, the Lutheran Church had these meetings in Waynesboro several years ago, every month, I think, it was different. And one of them was on the types of prayer, when they did the centering prayer. Like, probably a fourth of the people got up and walked out. They did not like that, just sitting there and coming back to Richmond, we had this discussion, I remember Diana Hoover's husband, what's his name? Anyway, it just about drove him nuts, because he's not the type,
right?
most of us are not the kind that just to sit still, and it really bugs us.
And I think nowadays, you're conditioned from birth before you can talk, that there's always a screen, noise, or something, a choice to make, right? What do you wanna watch now? What kind of cereal do you want? Like, I did that example a couple weeks ago, like, there's always something.
I have an email I get every day. It's called Encounter.
Mhm.
And it's basically a meditation. You have to be quiet, but it's a guided encounter. So you take a deep breath and you kind of center yourself, and then it has a Bible verse that you with something you're supposed to say in your mind afterwards, but they then go into more of a meditation. They keep saying, it's okay if your mind waters, come back to this centering prayer. And then they go to a Bible passage, and they take each Bible passage, and I can't tell you exactly how it goes, but anyway, then the next step, it's all guided, all the way through. I love it.
Yeah, some centering prayer doesn't work for everybody, but a guided meditation, or if being still is hard for you, and Lord knows it's hard for a lot of people. Yeah, so doing something with your hand, praying through your hands, praying through craftsmanship, but we did a whole prayer class, and one of the ones we did was even praying through debate. Like a healthy debate of, exchanging ideas, and, I don't agree with you at all. And then you get together to pray at the end. Man, that could be healing. So that could be countercultural. So I guess bringing this all together, we're living in a time of shift. There's lots of change and reaction to it. There's lots of influences. There's feelings of both shadow and light, of not knowing what's going on, but also having access to so much information. There's a pluralism and there's a tolerance. Into that world, we are called to live our faith through our vocations and listen from time to time. So next week, we'll wrap this up with I'll talk less, but we've got some good discussions, and then I've been promising some Bonhoeffer, we'll bring that in. We're gonna talk about Pentecost and what that means, since that is what next Sunday is, the Spirit sending people out. But for now, just everything we've talked about so far, the Sunday-Monday gap, listening intentionally, the society and the shift we're living in, and the fact that the church is no longer the top dog. Like, I feel like vocation ties us together. That's my take. That's what I'm presenting to you all in this class, is that we can bring our faith and our callings into this messy world wherever we go. And to me, that is more fluid and nimble. And that's my thesis.
So our vocation is to glue the colleges together.
Maybe, or just being conscious of the fact that every part of your life, God is a part of, working through you. What do you think? Does this teaching of vocation, what does it have to offer to the world we're currently in?
I think it took a big hit because of the pandemic. Because, I didn't like it, but we had a lot of cubicle people. And they were associating with each other and they were communicating, and that's now. Even after the pandemic, that's pretty much, I know, I mean, it changed our society more than most people think it has.
And how much,
Everyone come back all the way up.
it's really easy to say, and I do that, I find myself doing this, to say that, oh, well. You know, talking online isn't the same as being in person. Now, we believe in the word made flesh, right? Incarnation's a big deal for us as Christians. Having the tangibles on the table, knowing that experience stays with you. But that doesn't mean that just because it doesn't feel experiential to us to talk online, FaceTime, or even in through like gaming worlds where people are interacting over their headsets. For some people, that is community. So what do we do with that? Do you live out your vocation when you're playing Call of Duty online? Do you live out your vocation when you're on a Teams or a Zoom call for work? What does it look like to live out your calling on a Teams call? Or playing Halo or Fortnite or something? Video games.
Yeah, I knew that much, but
Yeah, well, they interact now, everybody's on a headset, talking to the other people. It's not like playing Mario Brothers, right? It's interactive.
I would think it'd be really hard, I don't do it, but.
Yeah.
To connect with a person.
on person.
Individual.
Mhm.
When you're in a group like that, I mean, even if you see someone who. You know, is maybe thinking of whatever the subject is in the wrong way, is not very Christian or honest or whatever. It's hard to bring your religion into that, or even, or you know, to say something about what you really believe, because 10 other people probably.
Yeah, or you could still model it even if you don't explicitly mention your faith. But how would it be if we said a prayer on Sunday, like, you know, God go with you into Fortnite and Halo and Call of Duty this week. A lot of people spend hours in those worlds every week.
I think what happens when you get online like that and you're not face to face, if you lose your humanity with somebody.
You can't, it's really toxic. out there.
And you lose your humanity and you have no consequence if you want to get belligerent or
Mhm.
cruel because the person's not in front of your face.
Keyboard warrior.
Yeah.
Just
And so then you end up with a situation where you lose your humanity and after a while, you don't really, you become robotic, I guess. is what I'm saying.
Okay, so my goodness, that sounds like a place we need the spirit of Christ more than any place. So we could very easily just write it off, and I'm not trying to criticize you, I do the same thing, it'd be really easy to just be like, it's such a gross world. There's no humanity, there's no consequence, you can say what you want and leave. Well, don't you feel like that's exactly where the love of Jesus needs to be?
I agree.
How do we do
But
that?
the problem is that's the point. I mean, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Because if you can't get them to, if they're losing their sense of humanity as far as between individuals, they're not going to very readily be receptive
Oh, yeah,
to it.
comment sections can turn into a cesspool instantly.
That's leading.
Oh, gosh, no. And even on something innocuous, like, you know, I ate a hamburger and it can just turn into, well, you're an idiot, you know, that's not even touching how bad it is.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's,
How could you eat falsely? You know,
one section of these articles is awesome.
I
It just shows the level of stupidity.
But I sometimes think like, why do you feel like you need to comment on this? Like, it can just be but that's the part I don't understand, and that's where I'm on the more Gen X side of things, and my in between is,
Has anybody
I
ever
don't understand.
saw the movie that the Germans put out before World War II? I can't remember his name, but it's called Metropolitan.
oh, yeah. Yeah, go Goebbels,
Yeah,
yeah,
if you get that, it was done about 1923, and it's a silent movie. But Hitler wanted him to be his producer for his stuff and he left, came to the States. So he's done a few movies in our country at the same
Maybe
time.
not, maybe not girls.
No, it wasn't Europe, no. So this, I'm trying to think of his name, but, you want to see something where they thought the future was gonna be, is scary. And ironically, some of that's happening.
Fahrenheit 451 is one I was
Yeah.
My gosh, he got some things right.
Said in 1923.
Science fiction is prophecy sometimes, like, and I don't mean like predicting the future, I mean like biblical prophets.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's making us aware of, the dangerous path we're gonna walk down if we don't change our ways. Anyway,
I find it hard in this whole thing to decide if we're going to accept some change and go with the change and make things better. Whether that's the change that we need to be making or not. I mean, how do you,
and can you even agree on what the change is? Yeah.
yeah.
Church
I think we-
service is a lot like that. We have people, it's like, we have too many different hymns, too many new hymns, or I don't like the new liturgy or something like that. I've heard comments about that. Somebody heard somebody say that.
Well,
Not one.
I don't know who it was.
and I feel like, and I'll stand by that one, if we only ever do the same setting that was in the LBW from 1978, we just keep doing that now. Then we're not gonna be able to handle any kind of new endeavor that Christ calls us to. So,
One of the churches I was in had the red hymn way back when,
oh, that read him.
and they, I'm not talking about you, which,
Yeah,
they would not change. I mean, we went through 3 hymnals before they ever decided to change it.
now, what I like about our system is. We might have 10 settings in the red hymnal, some from the blue one and the purple one, and I brought in this one from 20 years ago from this guy named Jonathan Runman, who's about as Lutheran as you can get. They all have different music feel. We might switch up the prayers from season to season, but the shape is the same, and you can trace the shape and the pieces we do all the way back to the earliest church. And so that will be the segue to next week. So Pentecost, everybody starts speaking in languages that everybody else can understand, no matter where they were from. And I had a professor in seminary talk about what languages do you speak, and it's very much vocation. And so that's what we're going to talk about next time. Is whatever the message is, the change is, whatever the gospel is that we have to bring through our vocations, we're going to have to do that speaking in the language of each individual vocation and context we go into. And that is the part I think that gives me hope, is even if the institutional church keeps having to shift and shrink and change and adapt. Something as big as that is like turning a boat. Like, remember that boat that got stuck in the canal last year or 2 years ago? That's gonna take a long time to turn that ship. But each of us individually, with encouragement and equipping and prayerful support from your congregation, each of us can adapt to our own context and our own languages bigger. That's where I see some promises. All right, thank you all. Let's close with a prayer. We haven't done that in a while. We actually finished sort of on time. Gracious God, thank you for this day. Thank you for your son, for his constancy. But also thank you for the times in which he challenged the status quo, flipped some tables, said, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Help us to find the balance between our history, our roots, our heritage, but also the need to adapt and to be flexible and to become all things to all people for the sake of your gospel. Thank you for the message we have to share, and help us to bring it each in our own ways to a world that always and still needs to hear. I pray in Jesus' name. Thanks, everybody.